Love, Hate, and Propaganda, The Cold War, a 4-part series with George Stroumboulopoulos. The global fight for your mind.
When it's clear there are enough weapons to blow the planet to smithereens, it's not surprising that nobody really wants to push the nuclear button. So what do? Well, you don't launch the missiles, but it's the Cold War, and the fight between the United States and the Soviet Union must go on. So how can you tell who's winning? Well, how about how many countries are on our side? Or who's got the most frequent flyer points in outer space? Or better still, who's got the better washing machine? It's all a big mind game. Each side does whatever it takes to show the world that its way of life is the best in a time of love, hate, and propaganda.
Moscow in the early 50s. People are working, shopping, playing, much like any other city. There's no obvious sign in the heart of the communist empire that this is a superpower at war. That's because in the Cold War, some weapons are invisible, like the sound of jazz.
Jazz, just like rock, just like punk rock, was anti-authoritarian, anti-establishment, and it was also very sexy.
And jazz music was considered valuable because it was a uniquely American creation. It was perceived to be so useful as a propaganda tool that the New York Times called it America's secret sonic weapon.
Alexei Kozlov is 18. He's a jazz fanatic, and that's dangerous. In the Soviet Union, jazz is banned. Why? Well, because it's a symbol of the enemy, America.
I'm obsessed with America. America is paradise to me. I complain about the ban on jazz to my parents. My father, who is a party member, is furious when he hears jazz.
It's not only jazz that's banned, it's a lousy time to be a creative type. Poets, writers, visual artists, filmmakers, they all have to toe the communist line. Individual expression is not permitted, and those who try may end up with a one-way ticket to a Siberian prison camp.
Alexei Kozlov takes that gamble, because even the simple act of listening to jazz could land you in trouble. Jazz recordings are hard to come by, but innovative fans take the risk and make bootleg copies on recycled X-ray film. Bones, they're called. Equally dangerous is listening to the voice of America.
Willis Conover in Washington, D.C. with The Voice of America, Jazz Hour.
America seems like another planet. Willis Conover's radio show is for us not just a source of information, it's our window to America.
Jazz is not the only thing Alexei and his friends hear on Voice of America. 1956. There's unrest in other parts of the Soviet Empire. The people of Poland are demanding better working conditions, and in Hungary, they're demanding more freedom. Alexei Kozlov and his friends listen to the events as they unfold, despite the personal risk.
We could go to prison just for talking about it.
Local authorities crush the demonstrations in Poland. As for Hungary, Moscow sends in the troops to smash what is now a full-scale revolt.
My dad, the loyal party member, believes that this crackdown is necessary. He's angry that we're questioning Soviet authority. He says that we should all be sent to the camps.
The man responsible for the crackdown in Hungary is Nikita Khrushchev. As the new leader of the Soviet Union, he has shown he's prepared to use force to protect his empire. But he also wants to portray a softer side to counter the Western image of the Soviet Union.
Khrushchev's image to the outside world is highly contradictory. On one hand, he promises peaceful coexistence. On the other hand, he is a full-fledged participant in the competition with the West and confident in the eventual Soviet victory.
Khrushchev also sees the need to release tension inside his own country after the long years of terror.
Part of Khrushchev's new propaganda is a rebranding of the Soviet Union. He wants to show the outside world that the country has changed. It's not a repressive regime. It's an open society with a future. Well, how can he project this? He throws a party and even invites some capitalists.
The World Youth Festival in 1957 was kind of like a coming out party for the Soviet Union. And it was coming out from behind the Iron Curtain and saying, hey, we're as much a part of the world as the rest of you, and don't believe all of that Western propaganda that says we are afraid and we don't allow our citizens to interact with other peoples.
More than 30,000 young people from around the world arrive for the Youth Festival. For the first time, young Soviets come face to face with the so-called enemy. The ban on Western music has been lifted for the duration of the festival, and Alexei Kozlov is in the thick of it. He's become a Soviet beatnik, and now he gets to hang out with exotic American jazz musicians.
I spent my whole time with an American-British quintet. Nothing else mattered. Now we got to meet real Americans.
Among those real Americans is a free-spirited young woman. Folk singer Peggy Seeger is a half-sister of the legendary Pete Seeger.
On the day of the opening ceremony, we traveled to the big sports stadium in open trucks. About 50 of us to a truck. The crowds chant, "Miri Drushpa," as we pass. We don't like your government, but you are welcome.
It's a hot summer. Young people have taken over the city. Excitement hangs in the air. And so does romance. Everyone gets caught up in the heat of the moment, including Soviet superstar poet Yevgeny Yevtushenko.
For the first time in my life, my socialist lips touched so-called capitalist lips. I kissed an American girl, breaking Cold War rules. I wasn't the only one. Many of my friends were doing the same in the streets, in the parks.
There was great concern among party leaders that young Soviet women would be unable to resist the charms of Western men who were participants in the youth festival. So they encouraged young Soviet women to remain chaste, at least for the duration of the festival. And we know that that didn't happen. There is a whole generation of 1957 babies, children born as a result of the festival.
When the party is over, Khrushchev wants to go back to life as usual. But some things have changed forever.
Was Khrushchev's party a success? Well, on the plus side, it did reveal the Soviet Union as an open and friendly society. That's good propaganda. But on the downside, it showed Soviets that Westerners were not really as evil as they were led to believe. Plus, they had cool stuff that they didn't have, and that's bad propaganda. But Khrushchev wasn't too concerned. He was about to ramp things up, this time with Soviet dominance in outer space.
October 4th, 1957. The Soviets launched the first ever man-made satellite into space. The historic event inspires American singer-songwriter Jerry Engler to write the first ever space-themed pop song. Called Sputnik, the satellite is about the size of a beach ball. Its launch and orbit of the Earth is a complete success. This day marks the beginning of the space age.
When the Soviet Union put a satellite into space, it was the greatest propaganda challenge of the Cold War. Why? Because here was a country that was barely industrialized 2 decades before, and all of a sudden it is beating the world's leading economic and technological power in this feat of incalculable symbolic significance.
And this created huge amounts of fear in the United States as well, because they recognized that the implications of what was happening in space could have a profound impact on what was happening in the arms race as well.
December 6, 1957, America strikes back. They are so confident of launching the first American satellite, they show it all on live TV. And the headlines say it all. Flopnik, Dudnik, Kaputnik. Khrushchev couldn't be happier. For the first time, he's ahead in the Cold War. Way ahead. He has achieved the ultimate mark of success in the West, the cover of Time magazine as Man of the Year. American Edward Bernays is a master manipulator. He invented public relations and wrote the book on propaganda. Bernays believes public opinion can be shaped and molded.
The engineering of consent is the very essence of the democratic process, the freedom to persuade and suggest.
He thought that propaganda was neither immoral or moral. It was just a tool for influencing public opinion to achieve what you wanted to achieve.
Bernays created compelling ad campaigns to convince the American public that bacon belongs with breakfast and that smoking is empowering for women. Now, he's about to sell the biggest lie he's ever sold. One of Bernays' clients is the United Fruit Company. The American company makes boatloads of money from bananas. In fact, they control the banana trade in Latin America.
The United Fruit Company practically owned Guatemala, and when they didn't like the guy who had just been democratically elected president, they asked Bernays for help.
That new president is this guy, Jacobo Arbenz. He's an army officer and a nationalist, and he's got big dreams for Guatemala.
Our government will raise the standard of living of the great mass of our people to the highest level.
Arbenz wants to give land back to the peasants. But United Fruit won't hand it over without a fight. Edward Bernays, the man who can sell anything, is going to sell the lie that Arbenz is a dangerous communist.
I was struck by the thought that although I was advising a banana company, I was actually fighting in the Cold War.
How can Bernays get away with this? Timing. His timing is perfect.
He was not operating in a vacuum. He was operating at the height of the 1950s Red Scare. This is the height of McCarthyism.
Investigating alleged communist influence.
Americans were already predisposed to see communists under every bedsheet.
The crusade for freedom is your chance and mine to fight communism.
Bernays takes full advantage of America's Cold War Red Scare paranoia. He uses a front organization to bombard the media with press releases, saying the Soviet Union is going to use Guatemala as a beachhead to attack the United States. He invites prominent journalists to tour the country. And who do they happen to mean? Well, carefully selected local politicians who, of course, confirm the worsening conditions.
Very quickly, the American press turns around, and all of a sudden, Guatemala is being portrayed in the American media as the next step of the Red Menace.
Bernays has manipulated the American media and the American government into buying his lie that Arbenz is a dangerous communist. Now it's time for the Central Intelligence Agency to play its part.
The CIA's propaganda tactics were dirty war tactics, guerrilla tactics. They were street-level strategies.
The CIA creates a clandestine rebel radio station to spread misinformation. Agents recruit students to distribute thousands of posters. They also provide guns and money to peasants to play the part of the Revolutionary Army. They target Arbenz's army with threatening leaflets. And just to be really sure, they spread rumor, intimidate, and offer bribes to some of the officers.
The main purpose of the propaganda campaign against the Arbenz regime was to create a sense of fear and confusion amongst the general population in the community, destabilize the government, and ultimately force Arbenz's resignation.
Edward Bernay's propaganda campaign against Arbenz sets the wheels in motion. The CIA propaganda campaign finishes the job. Arbenz loses control of the way the world sees him. It doesn't matter if the stories are true or not. Image is everything. For President Arbenz, it's game over.
A humiliated Arbenz resigns. It's not the armed revolutionaries that defeat him. It's the propaganda. Watching all of this is a young doctor named Ernesto Guevara, soon to be known as Che. The CIA-backed overthrow of Arbenz radicalizes him.
Che Guevara saw firsthand the way in which the Arbenz regime crumbled under the pressure of propaganda.
Guevara dedicates his life to fighting imperialism. And in the Cold War, this means the United States and its cronies in Latin America. In his revolutionary speeches, Che has a message for the U.S.
Cuba will not be Guatemala.
Che fights using the propaganda lessons learned in Guatemala. Always control your image and work the press.
Every act of the guerrilla army ought always to be accompanied by the propaganda necessary to explain the reasons for it.
After fleeing Guatemala, Guevara hooks up with a revolutionary named Fidel Castro. They put what they've learned about propaganda to good use in Cuba. Castro and Guevara invite the world's press, including the CBC, to cover their revolution's daily progress.
Don't you like?
Fidel Castro and Che Guevara were very conscious of their image from the beginning.
New Year's Day, 1959. After years of guerrilla warfare, Che and Fidel overthrow the government and make a triumphant entry into Havana.
When they emerged from the jungle, they kept their long hair, their beards, the cigars, and their fatigues. They presented themselves as romantic, conquering heroes.
Shortly afterwards, Fidel Castro goes to the U.S. and proclaims, "We are not communists." However, back home, his economic policies tell a different story.
When Castro came to power, he implemented a system of nationalization. And nationalization, in American terminology, was equated with communism and socialism, and therefore was simply unacceptable.
Relations with the U.S. deteriorate to the point where Castro turns to the Soviets for help. Cuba is now communist.
There's a new front in the Cold War. A communist country just 90 miles off the coast of the United States. And you just know that means trouble.
18 months from now, Cuba will be caught between the superpowers in a deadly game of chicken as the world moves closer to the brink of nuclear annihilation. New York, the summer of '59. The Russians are coming, and they're putting on a propaganda show in the heart of America. It's all part of a cultural exchange program with the Americans, a kind of warming of relations. But make no mistake, America and the Soviet Union are very much enemies, and this is war. War by trade show. Not surprisingly, the star of the Soviet show is Sputnik. Another chance to rub it in. Remember, they got to space first. A few weeks later, it's the Americans' turn. They're going to Moscow to do what they do best. Put on a show. A big splashy exhibit selling the American dream. Nikita Khrushchev has no idea what's in store for him.
These exhibitions were really popular during the 50s. A day out for the family to see up close the latest in everything. But this is huge. For the first time ever, America gets to show off the rewards of capitalism right in communist Moscow.
On the surface, the intentions of the exhibit were pretty clear. We want to make America look wealthy. We want to make it look diverse culturally. We want to counter communist fiction. It was about showing the Russian people that, in fact, what they have, the growth they think they're experiencing, is just a drop in the bucket compared to what they could and should have, and, of course, what the Americans have.
Tatiana Stepanova is one of the millions of Soviets who have heard about the exhibition. She's your typical Soviet schoolgirl, and she can't wait to go.
Everyone wanted to see the exhibition. It was a sensation. It was a must. We didn't know what to expect. We just wanted to go. I wanted to see American fashion. Fashionable clothes didn't exist in the Soviet Union. We were desperate to have a nice pair of shoes, a beautiful dress, or a coat. I thought nobody would look at me and fall in love with me if I didn't have the right clothes.
Each day, thousands of Soviet people line up to visit the American exhibition.
They stole all the Sears and Roebuck's catalogs. They stood out in line for hours to have a sample drink of Pepsi Cola that came in a commemorative cup, which they could then take home and put in their dressers. This exhibit opened the doors for American cultural infiltration into the Soviet Union in a way that no other program had before.
Vice President Nixon escorts Soviet Premier Khrushchev on a preview of the United States Fair at Skolniki Park.
The big propaganda story of the exhibition is Khrushchev and Nixon. A massive media scrum follows them everywhere. When they wander into an RCA exhibit showing the latest TV technology, they launch into a spontaneous debate that tackles the big themes of the Cold War. Every unscripted word is captured by TV cameras.
Еще нам 7 лет, и мы будем на таком же уровне, как Америка. А в следующий пойдем дальше, вперед. Мы вам приветствие такое любезное.
This is a propaganda setback for Nixon. It looks like Khrushchev is running the show. A quick-thinking young publicist named William Sapphire comes to the rescue. He guides the two leaders into a model kitchen. The media follow.
The Cold War actually is reduced to a discussion about washing machines. On the one hand, you have Nixon saying, well, anybody in the United States can afford these. And then on the other hand, Khrushchev was saying, well, the same applies in the Soviet Union. It's clearly not true. People could see through that. It becomes a lie.
The next day, these pictures showing Nixon looking in charge are splashed across American and international papers. The propaganda victory has gone to Nixon.
This spontaneous discussion between the two men became known as the kitchen debate, and it was a defining moment in Cold War propaganda.
I think arguably the Moscow exhibit is one of the greatest propaganda successes, potentially of the entire Cold War era, if not of the 20th century.
As for the young schoolgirl who thought nobody would fall in love with her, well, Tatiana Stepanova does fall in love. With an American guide, she gets engaged and is hoping to move to the States. The love story between the Soviet Union and America doesn't go so well. That brief experiment in cultural exchanges ends as mutual suspicions in the Cold War grow. The Soviet leadership regrets taking a gamble by opening its doors to the American way of life. It's a misstep that will come back to haunt them later. But there is one place in the communist empire where that competition over lifestyle is not just for show. Berlin.
The city was divided into two politically, but not at all physically, which means you could cross back and forth, and some people even, for example, would live on one half of the city, let's say in East Berlin, and have a job in West Berlin.
Although there is no barrier between East and West, the contrast is stark. Barbara Schumann lives on the east side, but she likes to visit her aunt in West Berlin.
I'm allowed to see her once a month, just for a day. I always have to ask permission and get a special letter from my school. And officially, I'm not allowed to bring anything back from West Berlin to the east.
But of course she does, despite the risk. Because West Berlin has it all. It's a showcase for, well, all things Western. Lots to do, see, and buy. And it's as simple as hopping on a train in the east and getting off in the west. Barbara's boyfriend is bugging her to run away with him to the west. She hesitates. But other East Germans are leaving in a hurry. at a rate of 2,000 a day.
The exodus is a double whammy for the East German government. First, it drains the already weakened economy, and second, it just looks bad, and that is bad propaganda.
The East German solution is both brazen and shocking. A massive barrier will prevent more people from leaving. August 13, 1961, the borders are closed. Barbed wire is installed, and construction of the Berlin Wall begins.
After they closed the border, there was chaos. People couldn't go to work anymore on the other side. Some who had stayed overnight couldn't get back to their families in the east. There was anxiety and panic about what lay ahead.
To get a sense for the shock on that day, you have to picture a row of houses where people were jumping out of fifth-story windows. You were jumping from East to West Berlin.
East German leaders claim the wall is to keep out imperialists, spies, and fascists. Barbara Schumann and her boyfriend remain on the east side. She's shocked by the wall, but now she has to shut up and pretend she agrees.
We have to go to political meetings praising the move of the East German government. But nobody speaks. Everybody keeps quiet.
I think the building of the Berlin Wall was a significant turning point. In propaganda terms, it's something that was not only horrific, but it also showed that the Soviet authorities would go to any lengths in order to maintain their own empire.
1957, Ghana is celebrating. It's the first colony in sub-Saharan Africa to gain independence. By the end of the 60s, 33 more countries will join Ghana. Africa has become the new battleground in the Cold War. Both the Soviets and the Americans want the newly independent nations on their side. The stakes are high. Africa is rich with mineral and natural resources.
Africa really is up for grabs. The African people want to be free, but they're not committed to communism. They're not in love with capitalism either. And so there's this sense that whoever can come in and take control can have access to those resources.
The Soviets and the Americans are both after the same target: young people, specifically the educated elite of Africa, the future decision makers.
People like Nigerian student Theophilus Okonkwo. He's a member of Africa's tiny middle class and wants to make a contribution to his country's future.
I am young, eager, and embittered. Like millions of others, I witnessed the injustices of colonialism. I seek ways and means to bring the reign of imperialism to an end.
The American propaganda campaign is way ahead of the Soviets. They have a secret weapon. The Americans are sponsoring jazz tours, including international superstar Louis Satchmo Armstrong. The man has it all: the instantly recognizable gravelly voice, the ability to make magic with his trumpet, and enough charisma to charm a stadium.
I never tried to prove nothing, just wanted to give a good show. But the music ain't worth nothing if you can't lay it on the public.
Armstrong's easygoing persona, not to mention his superstar status, helps to underscore the notion of America as the land of opportunity and equality. But all that is about to change.
So at the same time that the United States was seeking to win over the legions of African leaders in these newly emerging countries, you had the civil rights movement take place in the United States. And this created huge challenges as it was positioning itself as the leader of freedom and democracy, and yet a huge number of its own citizens were actively disenfranchised.
Little Rock, Arkansas. Segregated schools are now banned in the United States, but in the South, there's resistance to this mixing of races. A student is barred from entering Little Rock Central High School. The pictures provoke global condemnation. U.S. embassies around the world report back on the impact.
Many people around the world said, we simply don't believe what you say. because we see these images, and this is clearly not a free country. You don't believe in democracy if this can happen to school children.
Louis Armstrong is so outraged, he cancels a tour of the Soviet Union and denounces the American government.
The way they are treating my people in the South, the government can go to hell. The people over in the Soviet Union ask me, what's wrong with my country? What am I supposed to say?
U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower is pressured into taking action.
At a time when we face grave situations abroad,
The students are escorted into the school. Louis Armstrong agrees to continue with the jazz tours. The crisis in Little Rock is resolved, but the damage is done. The Soviets make the most of exposing racial injustice in the U.S. The Soviet propaganda campaign is now all the more appealing to young African students.
The Soviet propaganda message to students from emerging nations is pretty simple. Communism is a classless society where racism doesn't exist.
Theophilus Okonkwo is absorbing the propaganda barrage around him. He's convinced that the salvation of Africa lies in a close association with the Russians. He's accepted a scholarship to study medicine in Moscow. He's part of the first large group of African students to arrive in Russia. He soon discovers Soviet authorities have a hidden agenda. The students are urged to make public statements that favor Russia and denounce the West. Okonkwo is also offered a job making radio broadcasts for Nigeria.
All they wanted me to say was to extol Russia and call on my brother Nigerians to recognize, after attaining independence, who their real friends were.
As all young students do, African students coming to the Soviet Union expected to have an adventure. However, quite often they found their movement restricted. They couldn't throw parties the way they wanted to. They couldn't play jazz records. And of course, there were restrictions on dating.
Okonkwo's utopian vision of the Soviet Union is fading fast. What happens next is the last straw.
It starts when someone takes Okonkwo's photo and ends in a truly bizarre piece of propaganda. Remember, this is long before Photoshop, but the Soviets take a shot at cutting and pasting. They turn Okonkwo into their poster boy, literally.
This is me on the cover of a Russian magazine. A cameraman asked me to pose like a boxer. Now, I had chains around my wrists and an imperialist was whipping me. When I saw the magazine, I was shocked.
The magazine is distributed to newly independent countries, a reminder of the West's colonial past. After 2 years, Okonkwo has had enough. He and 2 other African students flee Moscow and release a warning to the leaders of Africa.
We consider it our duty to warn African leadership against communism and its dangers. Their Friendship for Africa slogans are pure propaganda, lacking sincerity.
The Western press seizes the opportunity to use Okonkwo and his fellow students to expose the hypocrisies in Russian propaganda. Eventually, Okonkwo returns to Nigeria, disillusioned with both sides in the propaganda tug-of-war. Both sides in the Cold War are armed to the teeth with nuclear bombs. The Americans have more than their Soviet enemies, but it doesn't really matter. The new hydrogen bombs are more destructive than the old atomic ones.
You are the target of those who would trample the liberties of free men.
Powerful enough to level cities and spread massive amounts of deadly radioactive fallout. A lot of 1950s nuclear propaganda is about fear.
But that's not the message a company called Bomb Shelters, Inc. is spreading in America. In fact, it says you can stay cozy and safe in your very own bomb shelter.
Maria and Melvin Minninson are true believers. A decade of nuclear war propaganda has worked on the couple. So in these scary days of the Cold War, the Minninsons jump at the chance to honeymoon in Bomb Shelter Inc.'s latest model.
It's not bad. It's a little warm, but the company is marvelous. My wife is a real good trooper.
The Minninsons are being used to sell bomb shelters and to sell the idea that Americans can survive a nuclear war.
The Minninsons were a nuclear family for a nuclear age. They were everything that the American family needed to become in order to fight this war.
The Soviets fight back with mass nuclear survival training. It's mandatory for all citizens between the ages of 16 and 60, including a young nurse from Leningrad named Tamara Yeremieva.
We learn to put on gas masks, do bunker drills and medical drills. We are taught to put a blanket against the window to prevent fumes from coming inside.
Soviet civil defense drills were aimed not necessarily just at preparing people to face nuclear danger, but it was also a way of bringing people together as a nation, to build unity.
The propaganda on both sides pushes the myth that nuclear war is safe and winnable.
Just what can you do if fallout comes your way? If any dust gets on you, brush it off promptly. That dust can burn your skin.
They wanted what I call the Goldilocks effect. On the one hand, they wanted there to be fear, because fear was necessary to mobilize people to take action. But they didn't want there to be too much fear, because that would lead to panic or apathy. The message was, the bomb could strike at any moment, but you can protect yourself.
The best protection of all is the special shelter, and it has at least 3 feet of earth over it.
And that propaganda is working on the honeymooning Minninsons, who are just climbing out of their bomb shelter after 2 long weeks.
God forbid we'll ever stay in one again, unless we have to during an atom bomb attack.
Since the Cold War began, the world has lived in the shadow of atomic Armageddon. The propaganda on both sides says nuclear war is scary, but survivable. That faith is about to be put to the test.
American spy planes discover the Soviets have snuck missiles into Cuba. For years, the United States has pointed megatons of nukes at the USSR. Premier Nikita Khrushchev is trying to counter this American advantage. But his gamble triggers a showdown with the new American president, John F. Kennedy. Don't let his good looks fool you. Kennedy is a cold warrior. On October 22nd, 1962, Kennedy decides to talk tough.
Shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
Kennedy orders the U.S. Navy to set up a blockade to prevent more nukes from reaching Cuba. This in itself is an act of war. Khrushchev responds.
The Soviet government considers the violation of the freedom of navigation in international waters and airspace to constitute an act of aggression propelling mankind into the abyss of a world nuclear missile war.
We have to keep it in mind that there were 2 nuclear-armed armies facing each other in a very tense situation, and any mistake, even a tiny mistake, could have triggered a war which would have certainly escalated to a nuclear confrontation.
The world is one misstep from nuclear holocaust. The United States puts its bombers and missiles on high alert.
Across the Western world, tension mounts, especially in America. There are soldiers in the streets. Stores report runs on bottled water and transistor radios. And thousands get out of cities to the supposed safety of the countryside. In the White House and the Kremlin, both sides argue over how far to push the other.
The tension associated with the Cuban Missile Crisis was considered almost unbearable at the time. I mean, we're now talking about mutual destruction here.
For 7 tense days, Khrushchev and Kennedy stare each other down while millions of lives hang on the balance. Eventually, they strike a deal, and nuclear war is averted. Just. All that scary propaganda, and coming so close to blowing it all up, have a profound impact.
The threat of nuclear war raised doubts about government leaders. It raised fears, and it created uncertainty, especially among younger people. And you can see all the origins of the various doubts and disruptions that would come to fruition in the 1960s. You can see all that in how Americans reacted to the bomb.